So when I was growing up here, spending all the time out in the Oswegatchie Hills, I was also taking a lot of notes of what I saw. So trying to keep a record of what was here. And so I used different little different notebooks and took notes. Um, I compiled some of these notes together into kind of a master list of the birds of Oswegatchie Hills, where I list all the species here. Um, so this in 1978, according to my records at least, we had recorded 162 species in the Oswegatchie Hills. That number has gone up since then. I have another more recent list of birds in the hills that's up to about 178 species from the time that we were here. So that gives you an idea. So we back then it was all pencil and paper. That was the way. I'd go out and I'd come home and usually write down a list. So this is May 13th, 1974. So I was 11 years old at that. Well, actually 10 years old. So what I wrote down here is flicker nest in dead tree next door, chickadee nest in tree, blue-winged warbler. May 14th, Baltimore Oriole, and about 8 exclamation points after it. I must have been pretty excited.
Cool.
Flicker nest where path crosses brook, possible woodpecker nest, prairie warbler, ruffed grouse nest near hemlocks. 4 exclamation points for that one.
Now there's no hemlocks.
Yeah. Bird nest with eggs. So, this is very early on, obviously. And as I grew older, the notes got more detailed and probably more accurate too.
So how could we tell that has changed?
So today, Cornell University developed this online database called eBird. And it's really an amazing resource as well as repository for bird data. So today when bird watchers go out, many of them at least, will record the species and numbers of birds that they've seen in an online app on your iPhone. You can do it, or you can do it at home on your computer. And when you go out, you would either as you go or after the fact put in the species that you've seen. And so Cornell or eBird aggregates all of these lists in one place. And what that does for you is you can actually then query the data and combines all these lists. And you can, for instance, here's a bar chart for the Oswegatchie Hills based on the lists that were put into the eBird system. And it tells you throughout the year when certain species are seen based on those lists again. So you can actually see that in the winter you're not going to see certain species because they're only here during the summer. And the eBird, for instance, shows that yellow-billed cuckoos are only found or have only been recorded in May, June, July timeframe, for instance. So this is a really useful tool, not only just for general knowledge, but also for bird conservation and understanding, the change in bird populations over time. So this is one way that is done. So a number of birds like to use early successional habitat. That's their preferred habitat. So blue-winged warbler is one of them. It's a small warbler. There's a blue jay calling in the distance here. That today, because the forest is matured to the point that it is with much taller trees, much less understory, the habitat has changed so that blue-winged warblers no longer find this area something that they would use. In the state of Connecticut, actually, shrubland habitat is one of the habitats that's declined quite a bit. So the birds that depend on that habitat have been in decline, not only in places like this where the forest has regrown, but throughout the state of Connecticut.
One place you can find these birds that are in succession areas is under the power lines. If they've cut down in the power line, cut down trees, regrowth, they're like it was here back in after the forest fire. That's where you see prairie warbler now, blue-winged warbler now possibly.
Correct, yeah.
And willow flycatcher, which we didn't have, but birds there would be found under regrowth under power line.
It's a combination of shelter and food. They've evolved and adapted to where that is what they depend upon to reproduce and survive. So
And some of the birds that nest in here are ground nesters, and they need deep forest areas surrounded by a forest before they'll nest anywhere. Some birds need at least 400 acres before they nest because of edge predation. There's a lot of, anytime you have an edge where you don't have forest, you have predators that can come in. Specifically now with humans, you have house cats. You have other edge birds like more crows. You have more blue jays, which nest on birds' nests and the birds themselves and the eggs. So you have more predators when you have edges. So you need deep forest, especially the ground nesters.
So Oswegatchie Hills is a really important place, obviously, because it is a large contiguous block of forest surrounded by houses and other development. But because there's these, hundreds of acres of habitat here, it's able to support a much more diverse population of bird species, and some of which really require, a large amount of acres of forest in order to want to use the habitat. So if you had a smaller block, a 10-acre piece of forest like this somewhere else, but it was isolated in 10 acres, there are many species that you wouldn't find there that you would find here, solely to the fact that this is a much more extensive and larger, unbroken block of habitat.
And along that line, that was one of the main reasons when the first developers came into the hill, which was development, which now contains the senior development containing 32 units, limited to 32 units. The neighborhood that I live in were opponents to that. And so we had town meetings where we were intervenors in the town meetings to try to prevent the development. And it went on for a year. We were unsuccessful in that the town failed to offer the builders certain things which he should have, the town should have. So they went to the Supreme Court of the state, and they won in Supreme Court because of the civil rights law, in fact. The civil rights were a federal law, federal court. So they got to go ahead with their 32 units. But the reason preserved was to maintain that contiguous forest, that we wanted to do that. The value of protecting nature for me, and I think human beings generally, is that we're evolved from humans that evolved to live in savannas and nature generally because they needed nature to survive. So we are closely attached to nature, and I believe that people find peace, solitude, and renewal when they visit nature or are surrounded by nature. And I think it's a human need myself. And I know I need it. And this has been very handy, very useful to me as a place, this Oswegatchie Hill Preserve, because it preserves that space in practically my backyard. So I believe because of the way we evolved, we still retain an attachment to nature.
Well, I'm just thinking about growing up here next to the Oswegatchie Hills and how that all the time I spent out in the hills with nature, how that really kind of shaped my life too, right? And I think a lot of people don't have access to this type of a place. So I feel really fortunate to have grown up here. And today I continue to be interested in bird conservation because I think there are a lot of threats today to birds, wildlife, and nature in general. So today I'm a member of I'm on the board of directors for the Connecticut Ornithological Association. I'm also on the board of directors for the regional board for Connecticut Audubon Society up in Glastonbury. And I also really believe in the importance of gathering data to really be able to document what changes are happening. So, back in the late 70s, we undertook a study of breeding bird populations in the valley up here upstream from Clark Pond. Um, I've also probably been participant in close to 100 Christmas bird counts.
Biggest the biggest day in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Point to Clark Pond and tell me anything about it?
So Clark Pond behind us here, you can see it's a very shallow pond that has a lot of emergent vegetation. It's a place that I would approach not from this end, but I would go through the woods and toward the far end of the pond, and
In the stream.
but it has wood ducks, ringneck ducks, osprey, use it for fishing, great blue herons. So it attracts a whole different population of birds that like the water. It's where I first saw my first wood ducks. I remember seeing wood ducks down here at the back of Clark Pond and being thrilled. The male wood duck is, of course, a very colorful bird, very striking, and this is where I first saw my first wood duck. So yeah, it's great to have here.
I think the headwaters of Clark Pond are a ravine, which is the deepest part of Oswegatchie Hill. There are several ravines because this has all been glaciated before, left ridge rocks that you can see the glacial marks. But we chose as a nesting bird survey study, but this ravine here, which attracts certain birds also. And like Louisiana water thrush, they like to build their nests in the sides of banks of streams. And so that's the reason they were here. And so there was a larger number of species in this ravine because some birds are attracted to riparian areas. And that's why we chose that spot, about a 32-acre area segment of that ravine, which we then published our studies in a magazine called American Birds, which is published by the Audubon Society, correct?
Yep.
And so the first one in this, we started our studies in 1977. And this magazine, it comes out every year about nesting birds. Happens to be the first one in this particular issue. And this is the first study, this is the beginning of our study in which we had to describe the habitat by measuring trees and quantitating the amount of vegetation, what kind of vegetation, and all sorts of things, in addition to counting the birds, the breeding birds in the area. So that was followed up by every year until 1980, which is the last one. And so I started out in the first two, but Andrew continued on until 1980 along.
Yeah, so we studied this site for 4 years in total in succession, each year recording the number of breeding pairs of birds that we found, and that was done through going out on a number of dates throughout late May and June and July. And I would go out and here's just one example of a list I did when I was doing that survey that shows what I found on May 26th, 1979. I had one ruffed grouse. Again, ruffed grouse are no longer found here, and a number of other species. So having this record now, going back today, you can see what the changes have been. And it's not just a casual observation, but it's actually quantified in terms of numbers, which is important. Yeah. So the Oswegatchie Hills, one other interesting thing to mention about the hills is that they're on a migratory pathway for birds. Not only land birds, warblers, and thrushes and things like that, but also it's a nice pathway for migratory hawks to go through. And so when I was a teenager, I would go on the roof of my parents' house, look out toward the hills, and the hills create an updraft for hawks to follow, to help them go on their way. And so I would do a hawk watch. I did this for a number of years, actually, and some days I'd have upwards of 500 different hawks, coming through. And again, I did that just by hopping on the roof and staying out there for the afternoon and counting the hawks. So that's another way to measure bird populations, is to watch what passes by.
And this is the time of year for that right now, in late September and early October. They're flying now.
Yep.
This is a good place for them to hunt food too at night, because they fly during the daytime. Hawks do, and go down in about 4 o'clock in the evening and hunt for food. So this has other birds in it which serve as food for them as they're migrating.
Okay,
All right. I think that's awesome.
it's a wrap.
You guys are the best.